The day they kicked me out of the house my husband built with his bare hands, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "You should be grateful we're even helping you leave with dignity." My son stood beside her and said nothing. I picked up my suitcase, walked out the front door without a single argument, and never told them I controlled every cent of my husband's $28 million fortune. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The house felt colder after Leonard died. Not empty. Not quiet. Colder. Even in late June, the air inside those walls carried a chill that settled deep into my bones. Maybe grief changes the temperature of a home. Or maybe it was the way people looked at me after the funeral. Like I no longer belonged there. The dining room still smelled faintly of roasted coffee and furniture polish from the reception we held after Leonard's burial 3 days earlier. His favorite leather chair sat untouched near the fireplace, angled slightly toward the television the way he always left it. His reading glasses were still folded neatly on the side table beside yesterday's newspaper. I hadn't moved them. I couldn't. After 42 years of marriage, every object in that house carried part of him. The scratch on the kitchen counter from the Thanksgiving turkey platter in 1998. The faded pencil marks inside the pantry door, where we measured our son Daniel's height every birthday. The small crack in the hallway tile Leonard promised to fix for nearly 10 years, but never did because, as he always joked, if I fix everything, what will I complain about? Those imperfections used to make the house feel alive. Now, they just reminded me that he was gone. I stood at the kitchen sink that evening washing dishes nobody had touched. My hands moved slowly through the warm water, while upstairs I could hear muffled footsteps moving across the hardwood floors. Vanessa. Even the way she walked irritated me now. Quick little heels tapping across the floor, like she already owned the place. She and Daniel had moved into the guest wing temporarily after Leonard's heart attack. At least, that was what they told me. Just until things settled down, Mom, Daniel had said gently at the hospital. You shouldn't be alone right now. At the time, I thought it sounded caring. Now I understood they had been positioning themselves long before the funeral flowers wilted. I dried my hands carefully and glanced at the clock above the stove. 7:14 p.m. Leonard used to sit down for dinner at exactly 7:15 every night. Never earlier. Never later. I stared at the empty doorway for a moment before catching myself. He wasn't coming downstairs anymore. The realization hit fresh every single time. A sudden laugh echoed faintly from upstairs. Vanessa, again. I tightened my jaw. 3 days. My husband had been dead for 3 days, and already she sounded comfortable. Too comfortable. Daniel entered the kitchen a few moments later. My son looked exhausted, though not with grief. His eyes were distracted, distant. He loosened his tie and avoided looking directly at me while opening the refrigerator. You should eat something, Mom, he said quietly. I'm not hungry. You barely ate today. Neither had he, but I didn't say it. For a moment we stood there in silence. The kind that used to feel peaceful when Leonard was alive. Now silence felt dangerous, heavy with things nobody wanted to admit. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. Vanessa ordered some documents from the estate attorney. I looked up slowly. What kind of documents? Oh, nothing serious. Just property paperwork. Insurance stuff. Dad's business accounts. Insurance stuff. My fingers tightened around the dish towel. Leonard's company wasn't stuff. Henderson Industrial Systems had been his entire life for nearly 30 years. He built it from a rented warehouse and one rusted pickup truck. I remembered the nights he came home smelling like machine oil and exhaustion while Daniel slept upstairs in his little twin bed. We sacrificed everything for that company. Vacations, weekends, holidays. And now Vanessa was calling it stuff. Why does she need those papers already? I asked carefully. Daniel shrugged too quickly. She's just trying to help organize things. Organize. Another word that suddenly sounded ugly. Before I could respond, Vanessa swept into the kitchen wearing cream-colored silk pajamas that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. There you are, she said brightly to Daniel before finally glancing at me. Oh, Elaine. I didn't realize you were still awake. Still awake. like I was some elderly woman who wandered halls at night confusing everyone. I live here, I replied evenly. Her smile tightened for half a second before returning. Of course you do. Daniel shifted awkwardly between us. Vanessa opened a bottle of sparkling water and leaned casually against a counter. We actually wanted to discuss something tonight, she said. Something in my stomach hardened. Leonard used to say women know before the bad news arrives. He called it instinct. Mine was screaming. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, Vanessa interrupted him smoothly. This house is enormous. Nearly 11,000 square feet. She looked around dramatically. Honestly, it's too much for one person. The audacity almost impressed me. My husband had not even been buried a full week. I've managed this house for over 20 years, I said calmly. Yes, but now things are different. Vanessa's tone softened artificially. You need support. Stability. Structure. Structure. I suddenly understood this conversation had been rehearsed. Daniel still wouldn't meet my eyes. Vanessa found some beautiful senior communities near Scottsdale, he muttered. I blinked slowly. Senior communities. There it was. Not even subtle. Leonard's funeral flowers were still sitting in the foyer, and they were already trying to move me out of my own home. I'm not moving, I said quietly. Vanessa sighed, as though I were being difficult. Elaine, please don't make this emotional. Emotional? I almost laughed. 42 years in that house. 42 years of memories pressed into those walls. And she wanted me to discuss it like a parking lease. Daniel finally looked at me then, but his expression wasn't cruel. That would have hurt less. He looked uncomfortable. Weak. Like a man already surrendering to someone else's decisions. We just think it makes sense, he said. Softly. We. He hesitated. Vanessa answered for him. Daniel and I. The room seemed strangely smaller suddenly. I looked at my son carefully. Really looked at him. This was the little boy who used to run into my arms after nightmares. The teenager who cried in my lap after his first heartbreak. The young man Leonard worked himself half to death to put through college. Now he stood in our kitchen letting another woman decide where his widowed mother belonged. I see, I whispered. Vanessa crossed her arms. You have to understand, maintaining this estate is expensive. Taxes alone are over $200,000 a year. Estate. Another ugly word. Not home. Not family house. Estate. Daniel finally spoke again. Too quickly. And honestly, Vanessa and I were thinking of starting a family soon. There it was. The truth underneath everything. They wanted the house. The pool. The guest wing. The land. The prestige. My husband's death had simply opened the door faster than expected. Vanessa stepped closer to Daniel, slipping her arm through his. We're trying to do what's best for everyone, she said sweetly. I looked at her manicured nails resting on my son's sleeve. Then I looked at the staircase Leonard built himself during the remodel 15 years ago because he didn't trust contractors to do things right. Then, at the wedding photo hanging beside the fireplace. Then finally at my son. How long? I asked quietly. Daniel frowned. What? How long have you been planning this? Silence. Vanessa answered first. You're being unfair. That was answer enough. I nodded slowly. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the kitchen windows. I suddenly felt very tired. Not heartbroken anymore. Just tired. Vanessa straightened her shoulders. Look, we already contacted a realtor. I froze. You what? The market's excellent right now, she continued briskly. And honestly, the property value may never be this high again. Property value. I stared at her in disbelief. Leonard had died 72 hours ago. Daniel stepped forward weakly. Mom, please try to understand. No, I interrupted softly. I understand perfectly. The kitchen fell silent. I removed my wedding ring. Slowly and turned it once between my fingers. Leonard used to twist it the same way whenever he was thinking hard about something. Funny the things marriage leaves behind in your body. Vanessa folded her arms. We'll give you 30 days, of course. 30 days. To leave the home where I raised my son. The home my husband built. The home where every piece of my life still lived. I looked at Daniel one last time, hoping, foolishly, that something inside him would wake up. But he just stood there, silent. That hurt more than Vanessa ever could. I nodded once. Then I walked upstairs without another word. Behind me, I heard Vanessa exhale sharply like she'd just completed a business negotiation. I entered my bedroom and closed the door softly. Leonard's navy robe still hung behind the bathroom door. His watch rested beside the lamp. His scent lingered faintly on the pillow next to mine. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to cry. Not loudly, just quietly. The kind of crying that feels like something breaking deep inside your chest where nobody else can see it. After a long while, I stood up and opened Leonard's desk drawer. Inside was the small black folder he told me never to lose. I ran my fingers slowly across the leather cover. Then I whispered the words my husband said to me 6 months before he died. If they ever turn on you, Elaine, to promise me you'll read everything before trusting anyone. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing again. I said nothing. Nothing about the trusts. Nothing about the company's shares. Nothing about the legal control Leonard quietly transferred to me years ago. And absolutely nothing about the $28 million they believed would soon belong to them. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vanessa's voice again. We'll give you 30 days, of course. As if she were doing me a kindness. The bedroom felt unfamiliar now. Not because Leonard was gone, but because something else had died with him. Something I had spent decades believing was permanent. Family. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to sleep and walked downstairs barefoot. The hardwood floors felt cold beneath my feet. Leonard always kept the thermostat too low at night, no matter how much I complained. You can always put on another blanket, he used to say with that crooked smile. I paused halfway down the staircase when I noticed light coming from the study. Voices. Low. Serious. I stopped moving. The trust paperwork has to be somewhere, Vanessa whispered. Daniel sounded nervous. Keep your voice down. I'm being realistic, she hissed back. Your father handled everything. Your mother doesn't even understand finances. I stood perfectly still in the darkness. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because of Vanessa. Because Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't say, my mother worked beside Dad for 40 years. He didn't say, my mother helped build everything we have. Nothing. Just silence. I looked down at my hands gripping the staircase railing. Those same hands once packed Daniel's school lunches at 5 in the morning before driving across town to help Leonard organize inventory invoices at the warehouse. Those hands balanced checkbooks, handled payroll emergencies, signed supplier contracts when Leonard was hospitalized with pneumonia back in 2004. But apparently now I was just an old widow who didn't understand finances. Vanessa spoke again. If she fights us on the property, things could get messy. She won't, Daniel muttered tiredly. Mom hates conflict. That one hurt, because it was true. I did hate conflict. I spent most of my marriage keeping peace inside this family. Smoothing arguments. Staying quiet when maybe I shouldn't have. But silence and weakness are not the same thing. People often confuse them. Especially selfish people. I quietly stepped back upstairs before they could hear me. Inside my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Leonard's black folder resting on the dresser. I still hadn't opened it. Part of me was afraid to. Not because of the money. Honestly, the number itself still didn't feel real. $28 million sounded like something belonging to strangers in magazines, not people like us. Even after Henderson Industrial became successful, Leonard and I never lived extravagantly. We flew. Coach. We drove our cars until they practically died. Leonard still mowed the lawn himself every Saturday morning until his knees gave out. We weren't flashy people. But Leonard was careful. Quietly careful. Especially during the last few years. Now I was beginning to understand why. Around 7:30 the next morning, I heard movement downstairs again. Cabinet doors opening. Coffee brewing. Normal sounds. Almost insulting in their normalcy. My husband was dead, and somehow life kept moving anyway. I changed clothes slowly and walked into the kitchen. Vanessa sat at the island scrolling through her phone while sipping espresso from one of my wedding china cups. My wedding china. The one reserved for holidays. She barely looked up. Morning.
No worms. No jam.
Daniel stood near the sink staring into his coffee mug like he wanted to disappear into it. I moved quietly toward the cabinet and reached for another cup. Vanessa finally spoke. We contacted a moving company. I froze briefly, but kept my face calm. That was fast. They're booked out for weeks this time of year, she replied casually. We figured it was smarter to reserve a date now. Reserve a date. Like I was furniture being relocated. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Vanessa, what? She said sharply. I'm trying to be organized. I poured myself coffee carefully. My hands didn't shake anymore. That surprised me. Maybe pain settles after a while. Maybe eventually something inside you becomes too exhausted to tremble. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. There's also the matter of maintenance costs. The guest house alone needs renovation. I looked at her over the rim of my cup. She talked about my home the same way investors discuss hotels. Not memories. Assets. Not grief. Opportunity. I'm sure you two have everything planned, I said quietly. Daniel finally looked at me then. His eyes were bloodshot. Mom, but he didn't finish. Because what could he possibly say? Sorry I'm letting my wife push you out 3 days after Dad's funeral? Sorry I stood there like a coward? Some things sound pathetic once spoken aloud. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced down and smiled. The realtor can come Friday. Friday. I almost laughed. Leonard's obituary was still pinned online. People were probably still sending sympathy cards. And they were already scheduling tours. I carried my coffee toward the back patio door and looked outside. Leonard spent years building that garden himself. Roses along the stone path. Small lemon trees near the fence. A wooden bench beneath the sycamore tree, where we drank iced tea every summer evening. 42 years of marriage sat in that backyard. Vanessa only saw square footage. I'll be out for a while today, I said calmly. Daniel looked relieved to hear movement instead of confrontation. Where are you going? Downtown. For what? I turned slowly toward him. To handle a few things your father asked me to take care of. That part, at least, was true. Vanessa barely reacted, but I noticed something subtle shift in Daniel's expression. Uncertainty.
Good.
For the first time since Leonard died, I saw a flicker of discomfort cross his face. Not guilt. Not yet. Just uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads quickly once people realize they may not understand the situation as well as they thought. I finished my coffee, set the cup quietly in the sink, and walked upstairs to get dressed. Inside the bedroom, sunlight filtered softly through the curtains Leonard picked 15 years ago because he said the lace reminded him of my mother's house in Savannah. I opened the closet slowly. Most of his jackets were still hanging there. I reached out and touched the sleeve of his gray wool coat. Then I whispered softly into the empty room. You knew, didn't you? No answer came, of course. But somehow, for the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt completely helpless. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing on the phone again. Confident. Careless. Certain she had already won. I said nothing. And that was exactly why she never saw what was coming. Downtown Phoenix looked strangely alive for a Thursday morning. People hurried across intersections carrying iced coffees and briefcases while I sat silently in the back of a taxi feeling like my entire world had ended 3 days earlier. Grief is strange that way. The world keeps moving as if nothing happened. As if your husband of 42 years didn't just disappear from existence. The driver asked if I wanted the air conditioning stronger. I told him no. My hands rested tightly around Leonard's black folder the entire ride. I still hadn't opened it. Not fully. Only enough to see legal documents, account summaries, and Leonard's handwriting clipped neatly inside. Even now, I could picture him sitting at his desk late at night organizing papers with that same quiet focus he brought to everything in life. Leonard believed preparation was a form of love. At the time, I thought he was simply cautious. Now I wondered if he had been preparing me for betrayal. The taxi stopped outside Henderson and Cole Private Bank, the same institution Leonard had used for nearly 25 years. The building looked exactly as I remembered. Tall glass windows, white marble entrance, gold lettering polished so perfectly it almost reflected sunlight. I used to come here with Leonard in the early years after the company began growing. Back then we still felt out of place around wealthy people. Leonard would squeeze my hand and whisper, "Half these men inherited money. We built ours." I stepped out slowly and adjusted my coat. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and expensive perfume. Quiet voices echoed across polished floors. For a second, I almost turned around. Not because I was afraid of the bank, because part of me still didn't want to know the truth. Sometimes ignorance feels safer. But then I remembered Vanessa scheduling a realtor before my husband's flowers had even wilted, and I kept walking. A young receptionist smiled politely. "How may we help you today?" "My name is Elaine Henderson," I said quietly. My husband was Leonard Henderson. Something shifted immediately in her expression. Recognition. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Henderson." "Thank you. I believe Mr. Whitmore has been expecting you." "Expecting me?" That caught my attention. Before I could ask anything else, an older man in a navy suit appeared from the hallway. Thomas Whitmore, Leonard's private banker. I hadn't seen him since last Christmas. His face softened the moment he saw
Me.
Mrs. Henderson. He shook my hand gently, almost carefully. "I was wondering when you'd come in." I stared at him. "You were?" Thomas hesitated slightly before nodding. "Your husband made certain arrangements before his passing." Certain arrangements. There was that phrase again. Everyone suddenly speaking in partial sentences. He led me into a private office overlooking downtown. The room was quiet, insulated from the noise outside. Thomas closed the door softly behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he folded his hands together carefully. "How are you holding up?" It was such a simple question. And somehow that almost broke me more than everything else. Because unlike Daniel or Vanessa, Thomas sounded sincere. "I've been better," I admitted quietly. He nodded slowly. "Leonard loved you very much." I looked down at the black folder in my lap. "Yes," I whispered. "He did." Thomas reached for a document beside him. "Mrs. Henderson, your husband transferred primary control of several family assets 18 months ago." I frowned slightly. "Primary control?" "Yes." My stomach tightened. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Henderson Industrial Systems, the Scottsdale Property Investment Accounts, Trust Holdings," he paused. "All under your authority." For a second I thought I misunderstood him. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "What exactly does that mean?" Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't know?" No, silence filled the office. Then something changed in his face. Not confusion.
Concern.
He leaned back slowly. "Mrs. Henderson, Leonard instructed us to speak only with you regarding these matters after his death." A strange chill moved through me. "Only me?" "Yes." I stared at him. "But Daniel is his son." Thomas chose his next words carefully. "Your husband's instructions were extremely specific." Specific. That word again. I suddenly remembered nights when Leonard stayed awake long after I went to bed. The occasional phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. The quiet tension in his shoulders whenever Vanessa visited. How had I missed it? Or maybe I simply didn't want to see it. Thomas opened another folder. The family trust currently controls approximately $28 million in combined assets. Even hearing the number aloud felt unreal. 28 million. I thought about the leaking faucet Vanessa complained about last month. The realtor, the moving company, the senior communities. They had been circling this money before Leonard was even buried. My chest tightened painfully. Thomas continued gently. In addition, Henderson Industrial remains under voting control through shares solely assigned to the trust. I blinked slowly. "So, Daniel doesn't control the company?" "No, ma'am." The room suddenly felt very quiet. I thought about my son standing silently in the kitchen while Vanessa discussed removing me from my own home. He truly believed he already owned everything. Thomas slid several papers across the desk toward me. These documents confirm your authority as sole acting trustee.
Trustee.
The word sounded too powerful attached to someone like me. I spent most of my life introducing myself as Leonard's wife. Now suddenly strangers were telling me I controlled an empire my son knew nothing about. I don't understand, I whispered. Thomas studied me carefully. I believe your husband anticipated potential conflict after his passing. There it was. Finally. Someone saying it plainly. I looked out the office window toward the city below. Cars moved through intersections. Tiny people crossing sidewalks. Ordinary lives continuing as mine quietly transformed into something unrecognizable. Did Leonard say why? I asked softly. Thomas hesitated longer this time. Then he answered carefully. He said he trusted your judgment more than anyone else's. My eyes burned suddenly. Not because of the money. Because Leonard knew. He knew what would happen after he died. And instead of telling me directly, he prepared a shield around me quietly, piece by piece, while I still believed our family was safe. Thomas cleared his throat gently. There's one more thing you should know. I looked back at him. The Scottsdale property, legally speaking, he paused. The house is yours alone, Mrs. Henderson. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there staring at the papers while Vanessa's voice echoed in my memory. We'll give you 30 days. 30 days. In a home she never owned. I slowly closed the folder in front of me. Then, for the first time since Leonard's funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. Not anger.
Clarity.
And clarity can become a very dangerous thing when people mistake your silence for weakness. I sat in my car outside the bank for nearly 20 minutes before turning the key. The folder rested quietly on the passenger seat beside me. $28 million. The house. The company.
The trust.
Everything Leonard spent his life building had already been placed under my control long before his death. And somehow, that hurt almost as much as losing him, because it meant my husband saw something coming that I refused to see. The drive home felt different. Phoenix traffic crawled beneath the afternoon heat while my thoughts kept circling the same question over and over again. When did Leonard stop trusting Daniel? I couldn't make sense of it. Not completely. Yes, Daniel had changed after marrying Vanessa. Anyone with eyes could see that. He became quieter around me, more impatient, less present. But he was still my son, or at least I thought he was. At a red light, I suddenly remembered a dinner from almost 2 years earlier. Leonard had grilled steaks outside while Daniel and Vanessa sat by the pool drinking wine. It was one of those warm Arizona evenings where the sky turns orange just before sunset. Vanessa had laughed lightly and said, "You know, this property alone has probably tripled in value." At the time, it sounded harmless. Normal conversation. But Leonard's expression changed immediately. Subtle. Barely noticeable. Unless you knew him as well as I did. He became quieter after that. Watchful. That was the first time I noticed him looking at Vanessa, not like family but like someone measuring risk. Another memory surfaced before I could stop it. Christmas Eve. Last year. I had gone upstairs to get more blankets for the guest rooms when I overheard voices from Leonard's office downstairs. Daniel's voice. Frustrated. "You don't trust me." Then Leonard. "This isn't about trust. It's about responsibility." I never heard the rest because they stopped talking when I walked into the room. At the time, Daniel smiled too quickly and changed the subject. Now I wondered what that conversation was really about. The closer I got to the house, the heavier my chest felt. Not from fear. From realization. Memories are strange after betrayal. They rearrange themselves. Moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly sharpen into warnings you ignored. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the realtor's car was already there. A white Mercedes SUV parked directly in front of Leonard's fountain. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel. You know that feeling when your grief suddenly hardens into something colder?
That.
The front door opened before I even stepped out of the car. Vanessa appeared smiling brightly beside a tall blonde woman holding a tablet. "There she is," Vanessa said casually. "Elaine, this is Cheryl. She's just doing a preliminary walkthrough." Walkthrough. like I was already gone. The realtor extended her hand politely. "So sorry for your loss, Mrs. Henderson." I looked at her hand for a second before shaking it. Behind them, I could see Daniel standing near the staircase looking deeply uncomfortable.
Good.
He should have been uncomfortable. I stepped inside slowly. Cheryl immediately began glancing around the foyer with professional eyes. "The ceilings are gorgeous," she said. "And these original beams add tremendous value." Value. Everyone suddenly spoke the same language. Not memories. Not family. Value. Vanessa smiled proudly. "We've invested a lot into maintaining the property."
We.
I almost corrected her, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I quietly removed my sunglasses and placed them on the entry table Leonard built himself 15 years ago. Cheryl continued walking through the dining room while typing notes into her tablet. "This neighborhood is extremely desirable right now," she said. "Especially for younger families." Younger families. The implication sat heavily in the air. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "That's exactly what Daniel and I were thinking." I noticed she no longer even pretended to include me in conversations about the house. Interesting how quickly people reveal themselves once they believe power belongs to them. Daniel finally approached me quietly. "Mom," his voice sounded tired. I turned toward him calmly. "Yes, I didn't know Vanessa scheduled this today." That was probably true, but it didn't matter anymore. "You still let her do it," I replied softly. He looked away immediately. That answer mattered more than excuses. Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving through the master bedroom. My bedroom. Leonard's bedroom. A stranger was now evaluating closet space where my husband's clothes still hung untouched. Something inside me tightened painfully. Then Cheryl called from upstairs. "The master suite is incredible." Vanessa laughed proudly. "It's my favorite part of the house." My favorite part. I closed my eyes briefly. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity again. Cold, uncomfortable clarity. Daniel lowered his voice. "Mom, maybe don't take everything so personally right now." I looked at him slowly. Personally. My husband had been dead for 4 days. They were selling my home. And my son wanted me not to take it personally. "You sound just like her," I said quietly. His face fell immediately. For a second, I finally saw guilt flicker across his expression. Real guilt. Not enough to stop what was happening, but enough to make him uncomfortable inside his own skin. Upstairs, Vanessa's laugh echoed again.
Sharp.
Confident. Careless. I suddenly remembered another moment from last spring. Leonard and I were sitting on the patio late one evening when he asked me something strange. "If something happened to me tomorrow," he said carefully, "would you be all right on your own?" I laughed at the time. What kind of question is that? But Leonard didn't laugh back. He simply looked out toward the garden quietly. "I just need to know you'll stop underestimating yourself someday." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. Now I realized he was talking about survival. The upstairs footsteps continued moving room to room, evaluating, measuring, pricing pieces of my life. And suddenly, for the first time since Leonard died, I understood something clearly. Vanessa believed she was the smartest person in the house.
That
Was going to become her biggest mistake. That night, I ate dinner alone on the back patio. Not because anyone told me to, because I suddenly couldn't stand sitting at the same table with them. Inside the house, I could hear Vanessa moving around the kitchen while speaking loudly on speakerphone. "The property has incredible resale potential," she said, "especially with the guest house." Guest house. Resale potential. She talked about my home the way Leonard used to discuss commercial buildings during business meetings. Cold. Calculated. Detached. The Arizona evening air was still warm, even after sunset. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked twice before everything fell quiet again. I stared at Leonard's empty chair across from me. 42 years. That's a long time to share a life with someone. Long enough that silence itself begins to change shape after they're gone. I used to know every version of silence Leonard had. His tired silence. His angry silence. His peaceful silence. But this silence felt different. This one felt unfinished. like he'd left something behind intentionally. The patio door slid open behind me. Daniel stepped outside holding 2 glasses of iced tea. For a brief second, the sight almost pulled me backward in time. He used to bring me iced tea exactly like that when he was 16 and wanted forgiveness after getting into trouble. Back then, I always forgave him quickly. Maybe too quickly. He placed 1 glass near me carefully. "I thought you might want this." "Thank you." He sat down slowly across from me, avoiding my eyes again. That had become his favorite habit lately, looking everywhere except directly at me. The garden lights reflected softly against the pool water while neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Daniel exhaled heavily. "Vanessa comes on strong sometimes." I almost smiled. Such a weak sentence for something so ugly. "She scheduled a realtor 4 days after your father died. She's trying to think ahead." "No," I said quietly. "She's trying to take over." That landed harder than he expected. I could see it immediately in his face. Daniel rubbed his palms together nervously. "You don't understand how stressed things have been." I looked at him carefully. "Then explain it to me." Another silence. Then finally, "The company's been struggling." That caught my attention. Leonard rarely discussed business problems at home during the last few years. He believed protecting family from stress was part of his responsibility. "How bad?" I asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly. "Dad made some expensive expansions before he got sick. The manufacturing plant in Nevada cost more than expected. Investors started pulling back this year." For the first time since Leonard's death, something began connecting inside my mind. The sudden conversations about property, the pressure, the urgency. Vanessa wasn't just greedy. They needed money. Daniel lowered his voice. "There are loans against some company assets." "How many?" He hesitated. "A lot." I stared at him. And suddenly I remembered something else Leonard said months ago. Debt changes people faster than greed ever will. At the time, I thought he was talking about the economy. Now I knew better. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly. Older somehow. "Vanessa thinks selling the house could stabilize things temporarily." Temporarily. Interesting word. People always soften betrayal with gentle vocabulary. Stabilize. Transition. Restructure. As if changing the language somehow changes the cruelty underneath it. "And where exactly was I supposed to go?" I asked quietly. Daniel looked down at his glass. "We found a really nice community in Scottsdale." Community. Not home. Never home. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "Did your father know the company was struggling?" "Yes." "And?" Daniel frowned slightly. "And what?" "What did he say about selling the house?" A strange expression crossed Daniel's face then. Small. Brief. But important. "He said the house stays in the family." I felt something cold move through my chest. Not because of the words. Because Leonard had already protected the house legally before he died. Which meant he never intended Daniel to control it. Even then. Even while alive. My husband already knew something his own son still didn't understand. Daniel continued speaking quietly. He became difficult. Near the end. Difficult. That word bothered me immediately. Leonard wasn't difficult. He was careful. There's a difference. How so? I asked. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He stopped approving certain financial requests. He restricted access to accounts. Vanessa thought he was overreacting. Vanessa thought. Vanessa wanted. Vanessa decided. It amazed me how often my son spoke about his marriage like he worked for her instead of beside her. Then Daniel said something that finally made everything clear. She kept telling him that eventually everything would belong to us anyway. Us. Not family. Not everyone. Us. The pool lights flickered softly between us. I suddenly saw the entire situation differently. Vanessa didn't marry into a family. She attached herself to an empire she thought was already halfway available. And Daniel simply followed the strongest voice in the room, just like he always had. When he was little, that voice used to be mine. Then Leonard's. Now Vanessa's. A painful thought settled into me slowly. Maybe my son wasn't cruel. Maybe he was weak. And weak people can become dangerous when someone ambitious starts staring them. Inside the house, Vanessa laughed loudly again. Then footsteps crossed the upstairs hallway. Confident footsteps. The kind of footsteps belonging to someone who already believes victory is guaranteed. Daniel noticed me listening. She's just stressed too. I looked at him for a long moment. You keep defending her, I said softly. She's my wife. And I'm your mother. That one finally hit him. His face tightened immediately. For a second, guilt flashed across his eyes again. Real guilt this time. But still not enough to stop anything. That was the tragedy of it. Daniel wasn't evil enough to feel comfortable. But he also wasn't strong enough to choose differently. I stood up slowly from the patio chair. The evening breeze moved gently through the lemon trees Leonard planted years ago. I'm tired, I said quietly. Daniel nodded, but didn't move. As I reached the patio door, he spoke again. Mom, I stopped. You know I love you, right? I closed my eyes briefly. That question hurt more than the realtor. More than Vanessa. More than the moving company. Because people who truly love you do not stand silently while someone removes you from your own life. I turned back toward him calmly. I think part of you wants to, I said softly. Then I went upstairs without another word. Behind me, Daniel stayed sitting alone in the dark beside the pool. And for the first time, I think he finally realized his father may have seen all of this coming long before any of us did. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For years, Leonard used to tease me about it. You wake up like a farmer, he'd mumble into his pillow while I opened the curtains. I stood quietly beside the bedroom window now, watching pale morning light spill across the backyard. The pool shimmered softly. The lemon trees moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked exactly the same. And yet the house no longer felt like mine. That was the strange part about betrayal. Sometimes nothing changes physically. Only the feeling changes. And somehow that hurts more. I dressed slowly and went downstairs while the rest of the house remained quiet. For the first time in days, I enjoyed the silence.
No Rielter.
No forced conversations.
No Vanessa.
Just the sound of the coffee machine and distant birds outside. I carried my mug into Leonard's study and closed the door behind me. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and his old cologne. His desk remained perfectly organized. Legal pads stacked neatly beside framed photographs. Business journals lined carefully across dark wooden shelves. Leonard hated clutter. Messy desks create messy decisions, he always said. I sat down slowly in his leather chair. For a moment, grief hit me so suddenly I could barely breathe. This was where he spent thousands of mornings building our future. And somehow, I had ended up here alone trying to protect it from our own son. I opened the black folder again. This time, I read everything carefully. Trust documents, asset transfers, shareholder agreements, letters from attorneys. The deeper I read, the clearer Leonard's intentions became. Nothing had been accidental. Every move was deliberate. About halfway through the folder, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Leonard's handwriting.
Elaine. Just that. Simple. Steady.
My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a short letter. Not dramatic. Not emotional. That wasn't Leonard's style. It read, "If you're reading this, then things unfolded the way I feared they might. First, remember this clearly. You are not helpless. I know you better than anyone else does, Elaine. Better than Daniel. Better than Vanessa. Better than even you know yourself sometimes. You spent 40 years protecting this family quietly. Now it's time to protect yourself the same way. Do not let guilt make decisions for you. And whatever happens next, remember, silence is not surrender." I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and held it against my chest. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring at Leonard's empty chair across the desk. He knew, not everything maybe, but enough. Enough to build walls around me before he died. Enough to understand our son might not remain strong once pressure entered the room. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I answered, the study door opened slightly. Vanessa. Of course. She glanced around the room briefly before stepping inside. You're up early, she said lightly. I folded Leonard's letter calmly and placed it back inside the folder. So are you. She smiled politely, but her eyes immediately dropped toward the papers on the desk. Curious.
Careful. Calculating.
I didn't know Leonard kept so much paperwork in here, she said casually. I looked at her for a moment before answering. He believed details mattered. That seemed to irritate her slightly. Not the words. The calmness. People like Vanessa expect emotion during conflict.
Tears.
Anger. Desperation. Calm people make them nervous. She crossed her arms loosely. Daniel said you met with the bank yesterday. There it was. I almost smiled. So, Daniel told her. Interesting. Yes. How did that go? I leaned back slowly in Leonard's chair. Productive. Her expression barely shifted, but I caught it. A tiny pause. A tiny uncertainty. Good. Vanessa stepped closer to the desk. You know, she said carefully, Daniel's under a lot of pressure right now. I said nothing. She continued anyway. The company situation is complicated. Investors are nervous. Payroll's been difficult some months. Complicated. Another soft word hiding sharp truths. And, I asked quietly. She hesitated. Then finally, we may need to make practical decisions quickly. Practical decisions. Selling my home. Removing me from the property. Treating Leonard's life like liquidation paperwork. I folded my hands calmly. Leonard already made his decisions. That one landed. I watched it happen in real time. Vanessa's posture stiffened almost immediately. Not fear exactly, but caution. For the first time since the funeral, she no longer looked completely certain of herself. What does that mean? She asked carefully. I held her gaze. It means your husband should probably spend less time talking to realtors and more time understanding his father. Silence. Heavy silence. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Then, almost too casually, she asked, did Leonard change something before he passed? There it was. The real question. Not grief. Not concern. Money. Control. Ownership. I thought about answering. About telling her everything right there.
The trust.
The shares. The fact that the house legally belonged to me alone. But then I remembered Leonard's words. Silence is not surrender. So instead, I simply stood up slowly from the chair. I'm going out again today, I said calmly. Vanessa studied me carefully now. Trying to read me. Trying to calculate what I knew. When will you be back? She asked. I picked up the folder. I haven't decided yet. Then I walked past her toward the door. Behind me, I could feel her watching every step. No confidence now.
No arrogance.
Just uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads fast inside people who built their plans on assumptions. As I reached the hallway, I heard her voice again. Elaine? I stopped, but didn't turn around. You should understand something, she said quietly. Daniel and I are trying to protect this family.
I almost laughed. Protect.
Such a beautiful word for selfishness. Finally, I looked back at her. No, I said softly. You're trying to protect what you think belongs to you. Then I walked away. And behind me, for the first time since Leonard died, Vanessa said absolutely nothing. For the next 2 days, the house became strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Careful. Like everyone inside was suddenly walking across thin ice, without knowing exactly where it might crack. Vanessa stopped talking openly about selling the property. The realtor never returned. Even the moving company conversation disappeared completely. That told me everything I needed to know.
She sensed something had changed.
And people become very cautious when they realize they may not understand where the real power sits. I said nothing. That was the part bothering her most.
No screaming. No crying.
No begging Daniel to choose me over his wife. Just silence. Calm silence. The kind that makes manipulative people nervous because they can't measure it. On Saturday morning, I came downstairs and found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen island staring at his laptop. The dark circles under his eyes looked worse. Financial stress leaves a very specific exhaustion on people. Leonard used to carry that same look during difficult years at the company. But Leonard never let fear make him cruel. That was the difference. Daniel looked up when he heard me enter. Morning. Morning. I poured myself coffee quietly. His laptop screen reflected rows of numbers and charts.
Spreadsheets. Forecasts.
Debt reports. He closed the screen too quickly once he noticed me glance toward it. Interesting. You don't have to hide business problems from me, I said calmly. Daniel sighed heavily. It's complicated.
No. I rapli šufli.
It's uncomfortable. That's different. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. For a moment, he suddenly looked much younger. Not like a corporate executive. Just a tired little boy who didn't know how to fix something. The Nevada expansion failed, he admitted quietly. Shipping costs exploded. 2 investors pulled out after Dad got sick. I listened without interrupting. Peril. We've managed so far. So far. Daniel nodded slowly. The kitchen fell silent again. I stirred cream into my coffee while morning sunlight spread across the marble counters Vanessa insisted on installing 3 years earlier. Leonard hated those counters. Too cold, he called them. Funny. Now they matched the house perfectly. Daniel finally spoke again. You met with the bank twice this week. Not a question. A statement. I looked at him calmly. Yes. He hesitated. Then, did Dad leave instructions? There it was. The fear underneath everything. Not grief anymore. Not even greed.
Fear.
Because deep down, Daniel already knew his father didn't fully trust him near the end. And now he was trying to figure out how much damage that mistrust could cause. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Your father left many instructions. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly.
Mom, no, I interrupta Janli.
You don't get to question me like I'm an employee in your company. That hit him immediately. I could see it in his face.
Good.
For too long, everyone in this house had mistaken my kindness for weakness. Daniel looked down at the counter. I'm trying to keep everything together. I almost felt sorry for him then. Almost. Because beneath the exhaustion and pressure, there was still a choice he had made every single day since Leonard died. He chose Vanessa. He chose silence. He chose convenience over loyalty. Weakness is still a choice when it hurts innocent people. Before I could respond, Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing workout clothes and carrying her phone. She stopped the moment she noticed us speaking alone. Interesting again. She no longer trusted conversations she couldn't control. Good morning, she said carefully. Not cheerful anymore. Careful. I nodded politely. Vanessa walked toward the refrigerator, but kept glancing toward Daniel. Silent communication. Married people develop it over time. Little looks that carry entire conversations. Are you telling her anything? Does she know? What did the bank say? Daniel avoided her eyes completely. That told her enough already. She closed the refrigerator harder than necessary. So, she said lightly, I spoke to the company attorney yesterday. I remained silent. He thinks we should start restructuring certain assets quickly.
We.
Always we. Not Daniel. Not the
family. We.
And why is that? I asked calmly. Vanessa crossed her arms. To avoid future complications. Future complications. Another soft phrase hiding ugly intentions. I looked directly at her. What complications exactly? For a second, she hesitated.
Small.
But noticeable. Then she smiled again. You know, probate issues. Taxes. Legal confusion. Legal confusion. Interesting choice of words considering Leonard had apparently removed all confusion before dying. Daniel suddenly stood up. I need to take this call, he muttered, grabbing his laptop too quickly. Cowardice often arrives disguised as timing. The moment he left the room, the atmosphere changed immediately. Vanessa turned toward me fully. No pretending now.
No fake sweetness.
Just calculation. You've been very calm lately, she said quietly. I folded my hands around my coffee mug. Should I be hysterical instead? That's not what I meant.
No.
She studied me carefully. I think Leonard may have hidden things from Daniel. There it was again. Fishing. Searching. Trying to measure what I knew without exposing herself completely. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Leonard was a very intelligent man. That irritated her. I saw it instantly. People like Vanessa become frustrated when they cannot control the direction of conversations. He should have trusted his son, she said sharply. I tilted my head slightly. Did he trust you? Silence. A dangerous silence this time. Vanessa's expression hardened immediately. Then slowly she smiled. But there was no warmth left in it. You know, she said softly, families fall apart very quickly once money gets involved. I almost laughed at that. Money didn't destroy this family.
Character did.
Money simply exposed it faster. I stood up slowly and carried my coffee cup toward the sink. Behind me, Vanessa spoke again. If Daniel loses the company, it will destroy him. That one was real, not manipulation.
Fear.
Finally, an honest sentence. I turned around calmly. Then maybe he should have thought about that before trying to throw his widowed mother out of her own home. Vanessa's face went completely still. No response.
No clever comeback.
Because for the first time since Leonard died, she was beginning to realize something terrifying. The quiet old woman she thought she could remove from the board was no longer playing defense. By Monday morning, the tension inside the house had become impossible to ignore. Nobody argued openly. That would have been easier. Instead, everything turned quiet in the ugliest way possible. Whispers stopped when I entered rooms. Laptop screens closed too quickly. Phone calls ended the moment footsteps approached. The entire house felt like people preparing for something without knowing exactly when it would happen. And underneath all of it, fear. Not mine. Theirs. I noticed it first in Daniel. He stopped sleeping properly. I could hear him pacing upstairs after midnight, moving between the bedroom and Leonard's old office over and over again. One night around 2 a.m, I walked downstairs for water and found light spilling beneath the study door. Daniel sat alone inside staring at spreadsheets spread across Leonard's desk. For a second, he looked almost identical to his father. Same posture, same tired eyes. But Leonard carried pressure differently. Leonard became quieter under stress. Daniel became weaker. He looked up sharply when he saw me standing there. Mom. I glanced at the papers covering the desk. Debt projections. Cash flow reports. Bank notices. The company situation was worse than he admitted. Much worse. You should sleep, I said calmly. Daniel laughed once under his breath. I don't think I can. I leaned lightly against the doorway. When was the last time you ate something? He shrugged.
Ai fine.
People always say that right before falling apart. I studied my son carefully. There was still goodness inside him somewhere. I believed that. But goodness, without strength, becomes useless when selfish people start pulling strings. Does Vanessa know how bad things are? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated too long. She knows enough. Enough. Interesting answer. I stepped further into the room slowly. Leonard's chair remained empty behind the desk. Neither of us sat there anymore. It almost felt sacred now. Daniel rubbed both hands across his
face.
The bank froze one of the expansion accounts this morning. I said nothing. They said additional authorization is required. There it was. The beginning. Daniel looked at me carefully now, almost cautiously. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I met his eyes calmly. I know your father believed in safeguards. That answer unsettled him immediately.
Good.
For the first time since Leonard died, uncertainty was finally shifting in the right direction. Daniel leaned back heavily. Mom, if there's something Dad arranged, you need to tell me.
Need.
Not ask.
Need.
Funny how quickly desperation changes people's tone. I folded my arms quietly. Why? Because this affects all of us.
No.
It affected him. And he was only calling it family now because the consequences had finally reached his doorstep. I watched him carefully for a long moment before speaking. Did it affect all of us when Vanessa scheduled a realtor before your father's funeral flowers died? Daniel looked down immediately. That silence answered everything. Again. Always silence. A phone buzzed upstairs suddenly. A few seconds later, quick footsteps crossed the hallway overhead. Vanessa. Even her footsteps sounded impatient lately. Daniel lowered his voice. She's scared. I almost laughed at that. Scared people reveal who they truly are faster than angry people do. She should be, I replied quietly. That landed harder than I expected. Daniel stared at me for a second like he suddenly realized he no longer understood the woman standing in front of him. Honestly, neither did I. Because for most of my life, I prioritized peace over power. Now peace was gone. And power was the only thing keeping me from being discarded. The next morning, things escalated. I came downstairs around 8 and found Vanessa arguing softly on the phone near the kitchen window. No, that's impossible, she whispered sharply. Daniel should have access. She stopped immediately when she noticed me, then forced a smile. Good morning. I poured coffee quietly without answering right away. Vanessa ended the call too quickly. Another sign of panic. Interesting. She walked toward the island slowly. There seems to be some confusion with the company accounts. Confusion. Still using soft words. I stirred cream into my coffee calmly. I'm sure the bank knows what it's doing. Her jaw tightened slightly. Payroll processing was delayed this morning. I looked at her over the rim of my cup. And employees are asking questions. For the first time since Leonard died, I finally heard genuine fear in her voice. Not manipulation. Not performance.
Fear.
Because money problems are no longer theoretical once payroll gets involved. That's when consequences become public. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table Leonard bought during our 10th year of marriage. Vanessa remained standing. Nervous people rarely sit still. Did Leonard tell you something before he died? She asked carefully. There it was again. Fishing. Searching. Trying to find out how much danger she was actually in. I looked directly at her. My husband told me many things over 42 years. That's not what I mean. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then Vanessa made her mistake. If the company collapses, Daniel could lose everything.
Could. Not we.
Not family. Daniel. Finally, honesty. I leaned back calmly. And whose fault would that be? Her eyes narrowed instantly. You think this is my fault? I thought about the realtor. The moving company. The senior living brochures. The way she stood in my kitchen discussing my removal before Leonard had even been buried. Then I answered honestly. I think you saw my husband's death as an opportunity. That hit her like a slap. Vanessa's face changed immediately.
Cold now. No pretending anymore.
You have no idea what pressure we've been under.
No. I rapli sufli.
I think I finally do. She stared at me for several long seconds. Then quietly said something that told me exactly how desperate she had become. If Daniel loses this company, your grandson may never even exist. I froze slightly. Grandson. So that was the future she kept protecting. Not family. Inheritance. Legacy. Security. Everything always came back to ownership with her. I stood up slowly from the table. My husband spent his entire life building that company, I said calmly. And the first thing you tried to build after his death was an exit plan for me. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because deep down, she knew it was true. And truth becomes very hard to argue with once fear finally enters the room. 2 days later, Daniel finally asked me to meet him in Leonard's office. Not the kitchen, not the patio, the office. That alone told me how serious things had become. Leonard's study used to intimidate Daniel when he was younger. Even as a teenager, he knocked before entering. Something about the room carried authority naturally. Now, for the first time since the funeral, my son looked genuinely afraid sitting behind that desk. Not angry, not defensive, afraid. I stepped inside quietly around 7 that evening. The sunset outside painted long orange shadows across the bookshelves while the desk lamp cast soft light over stacks of financial reports scattered everywhere. Daniel looked exhausted. His tie hung loose around his neck. His sleeves were rolled unevenly. Empty coffee cups covered half the desk. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood using his bare hands. You wanted to talk, I said calmly. He nodded. Please sit down. I remained standing for a moment before finally taking the chair across from him. Leonard's chair still stayed empty behind the desk. Neither of us touched it. Daniel rubbed both hands together nervously. The bank froze 3 more accounts today. I said nothing. They're requesting trustee authorization on major transactions.
Trustee.
Interesting how quickly he learned the vocabulary once consequences arrived. Daniel swallowed hard. Mom, are you the trustee? There it was. Finally. No more guessing. No more circling around the truth. I looked at my son quietly for several seconds before answering. Yes. The word landed heavily between us. Daniel leaned back slowly like someone had just punched the air out of his chest. For a long moment, he simply stared at me. You knew this whole time? Yes. And you didn't tell me? I almost smiled at that. After everything. After the realtor. After trying to push me into a senior community. Now, suddenly, honesty mattered. I wasn't aware. I owed immediate transparency to people trying to remove me from my own home. I replied softly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The shame finally looked real now. Good. He opened another file on the desk with trembling hands. Mom, the company's in serious trouble. I stayed silent. The Nevada project buried us. Dad was covering losses personally near the end. That surprised me slightly. Leonard never discussed the severity of business problems openly. Not with me. Certainly not with Daniel. Why didn't he shut the expansion down? I asked. Daniel laughed bitterly. Because he thought I could fix it. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Because beneath all the weakness and bad decisions, part of Daniel was still just a son desperate for his father's approval. And Leonard died before giving it to him. The office grew quiet again. Finally, Daniel looked directly at me. I need access to those accounts. Not. Can we discuss this? Not. Please help. Need. Even now, pressure kept turning him into a smaller version of himself. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Why? Because payroll hits Friday. There it was. The real emergency. Employees. Operations. Public collapse. Not luxury anymore. Survival. Daniel leaned forward desperately. If payroll bounces, people panic. Vendors panic. Investors panic. And whose fault is that? His jaw tightened immediately. Mom, please.
No. Interrupta sufli.
You don't get to pressure me now after standing there while your wife tried to throw me out. He looked away again. Always looking away. Cowardice has habits. I never wanted things to go this far, he muttered. But they did. Silence. Then, quietly, Vanessa pushed too hard. I almost laughed. Interesting. Now it was Vanessa. Not we. Not us. Her. People always separate themselves from bad decisions once consequences arrive. I studied my son carefully. He looked tired enough to collapse. And suddenly, I remembered him at 8 years old sitting at our kitchen table trying not to cry after losing a baseball game. Leonard sat beside him and said, Pressure reveals character, Danny, not talent. At the time, Daniel nodded, seriously like children do when they want to sound older than they are. Now I wondered if he ever truly understood the lesson. A knock interrupted us suddenly. Before either of us answered, Vanessa entered the office. Of course she did. Her eyes moved immediately between our faces, reading tension, calculating information. What's going on? She asked carefully. Neither of us answered immediately. That told her enough already. Her expression sharpened instantly. Then she looked directly at me. You're the trustee. Not a question. A realization. I held her gaze calmly. Yes. The room changed after that. You could feel it physically, like invisible walls suddenly rearranged themselves. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So, this whole time you knew you controlled the assets? Assets. Always that word. Never family. Never legacy. Assets. I stood slowly from my chair. This whole time, I replied quietly, you believed I was powerless. That hit her hard. I saw a genuine panic flicker across her face for the first time. Not irritation. Not frustration. Panic. Because she finally understood something critical. Leonard never left the empire vulnerable after his death. He left it with me. Daniel stood up too quickly. Please, he said. Can we stop fighting and focus on fixing this?
Fixing this.
Interesting phrase. As if this situation appeared naturally instead of being built piece by piece through greed and arrogance. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. You told me your father trusted you with the company.
He did.
Then why would he put everything under her control? Her. Not your mother. Her. Daniel looked trapped now. Good. Because truth eventually corners everyone. Finally, he answered quietly. Maybe because he knew Mom would protect it. Silence. Heavy silence. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief, then slowly turned back toward me. And for the first time since Leonard died, I saw something disappear from her face completely. Confidence. She understood now. The quiet widow she tried to remove from the board was actually the person holding the entire company together. After that night, everything changed inside the house. Not loudly.
Quietly.
That's how power shifts happen in families sometimes.
No.
Screaming.
No dramatic scenes.
Just a subtle change in the air when people finally understand who actually holds control. Vanessa stopped giving instructions to everyone. Daniel stopped avoiding eye contact with me. And for the first time since Leonard died, nobody mentioned moving me out again. Interesting how quickly respect appears once money disappears from reach. The next morning, I found Vanessa standing alone in the kitchen staring at her phone. She looked tired. Not emotionally tired. Financially tired. There's a difference. People carrying emotional pain look heavy. People carrying financial panic look sharp around the edges. Irritated. Restless. Distracted. Vanessa barely glanced up when I entered. We need to talk, she said immediately. Need again. Everyone suddenly needed things from me. I poured coffee slowly before answering. About what? The company. Of course. Not the family. Not Leonard. Not the way they treated me. The company. I sat quietly at the kitchen table. Vanessa remained standing near the counter with her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Defensive posture. Fear posture. Interesting. She took a breath. Daniel told me about the trust. I stirred cream into my coffee calmly. And if you don't release access to those accounts, the company could collapse within weeks.
Collapse.
A very powerful word, especially coming from someone who spent days treating my home like real estate inventory. I looked at her carefully. Then perhaps you shouldn't have tried removing the person controlling the accounts. Her jaw tightened instantly. We didn't know.
No apology.
Just justification. You'd be amazed how often selfish people believe ignorance erases cruelty. I took another sip of coffee. Outside, the pool shimmered beneath the Arizona morning sun while landscapers worked quietly near the back fence. Normal life continuing again. Meanwhile, inside the house, everything was shifting. Vanessa sat down across from me suddenly. That surprised me. People like her usually prefer standing during uncomfortable conversations. Standing feels dominant. Sitting meant she no longer felt dominant. Good. She lowered her voice. You need to understand something about Daniel. I almost smiled. Whenever people begin sentences that way, they're usually preparing excuses. He's drowning right now.
No. Irraplia sufli.
He's facing consequences. That's unfair. Is it? Silence. Then she leaned forward carefully. Leonard put enormous pressure on him. There it was. Blame the dead man. The oldest strategy in the world. I looked directly at her. My husband built a company from nothing while raising a family. Don't confuse pressure with expectation. That landed harder than she expected. Vanessa looked away briefly. For the first time since I met her, she suddenly seemed younger. Not softer. Just less certain. He wanted Daniel to become him, she muttered quietly. I thought about Leonard working 14-hour days for decades. The missed vacations. The sleepless nights. The years he carried entire payrolls personally during recessions so employees could keep their homes.
No.
Leonard never wanted Daniel to become him. He wanted Daniel to become stronger than him. But strength cannot grow inside people protected from consequences too long. Footsteps entered the kitchen behind us. Daniel. He looked between both of us immediately, tense already. What's going on? Vanessa stood up quickly. We're talking. Dangerous answer. Daniel noticed it too. His shoulders tightened instantly. The stress inside him seemed visible now, like someone stretching wire too tightly before it snaps. I watched my son carefully. He had lost weight in just over a week. His eyes constantly looked tired now. Leonard used to carry stress in silence. Daniel carried it in collapse. He sat beside Vanessa heavily. The payroll issue got worse, he admitted quietly. How bad? I asked. He rubbed his forehead. If funds don't clear by Thursday, employees won't get paid. Thursday. 2 days. The kitchen became very still. I knew what that meant. Panic spreads fast once workers miss paychecks. Vendors tighten. Investors flee. Rumors multiply. Companies rarely die all at once. They die from fear. Daniel looked at me carefully. I'm asking for your help. Finally. Not demanding. Not assuming. Asking. It only took nearly losing everything. I folded my hands calmly. What exactly are you asking for? Temporary release authorization from the trust accounts. Vanessa added quickly. Just enough to stabilize operations. Stabilize again. Always soft words. I remained quiet long enough to make both of them uncomfortable. Then I asked the only question that mattered. If Leonard were sitting here right now, what would he say about the way you treated me? Neither answered. That silence told me more than apologies ever could. Daniel looked down first. Vanessa crossed her arms again. Defensive. Cornered. Finally, Daniel whispered. We were wrong. Simple words. Late words. But real. I studied my son carefully. For the first time since the funeral, he looked less like a frightened executive and more like the little boy who once sat beside me after making mistakes too big for him to fix alone. But adulthood changes the stakes of mistakes. Some mistakes wound families permanently. I stood up slowly from the table and carried my coffee cup to the sink. Behind me, Daniel's voice sounded small. Mom. I turned back toward them calmly. You tried to throw me out of my own home 4 days after your father died. Neither moved. Neither spoke. You treated grief like a business inconvenience. Vanessa's eyes filled slightly then. Not tears exactly. Humiliation.
Good.
You both assumed I was weak because I stayed quiet. The kitchen felt completely still now. Even the sound of the landscapers outside seemed far away. Then finally, I said the thing neither of them expected. I'll help save the company. Daniel looked stunned. Vanessa blinked in disbelief. But before relief could fully reach their faces, I continued calmly. On one condition. Fear returned immediately.
Fast. Sharp.
Because deep down, both of them already knew this was the moment the balance of power truly changed. And this time, I would be the one setting the terms. Neither of them spoke after I said it. I'll help save the company. The kitchen stayed completely silent. Daniel looked relieved for exactly half a second before my final sentence erased it. On one condition. Fear changes people's faces very quickly, especially people who thought they already controlled the outcome. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened immediately. Daniel swallowed hard. What condition? He asked quietly. I looked at both of them carefully before answering. You will move out of this house. The silence afterward felt enormous. Vanessa blinked first. I'm sorry, what? You heard me. Daniel stared at me like he wasn't sure he understood correctly.
Mom, no. Interrupta sufli.
You wanted practical decisions. This is one. Vanessa laughed once under her breath. Not amused.
Shocked.
You're throwing us out? Interesting. Now suddenly removal from a home sounded cruel. I folded my hands calmly. You attempted to remove a grieving widow from the house she shared with her husband for 42 years. That's different.
No. Iraplia quietly.
It only feels different because now you're the ones losing comfort. Daniel stood up too quickly, pacing toward the window. This is insane. Insane. Another word people use when consequences finally reach them personally. Outside, the pool lights reflected softly against the water as evening settled across the backyard. Leonard loved evenings in that yard. We used to sit outside after dinner listening to the fountain while Arizona heat slowly faded into night. For years, I thought those evenings were the safest part of my life. Now I realize safety inside families is often temporary. Daniel turned back toward me. You'd really force us out? I met his eyes calmly. You forced me out first. We never actually made you leave. That sentence almost made me smile. Cruel people always rewrite history once they become vulnerable. I looked directly at Vanessa. You hired a realtor before my husband was buried. She crossed her arms tightly. We were trying to survive. And so was I. Silence again. Then I continued calmly. The difference is, I never treated either of you like disposable inconveniences. Daniel sat back down heavily, rubbing both hands across his face. He suddenly looked exhausted beyond words.
Good.
Some lessons should feel heavy. Vanessa's voice sharpened. So what? You save the company only if we leave. Yes. That's manipulative. I almost laughed at
That.
manipulation from the woman who spent days trying to quietly erase me from my own life. No, I said softly. It's boundaries. That word hit her harder than anger would have. Because people like Vanessa understand control. But boundaries? Boundaries terrify them. Daniel finally spoke again. Where exactly are we supposed to go? Interesting. He asked the same question I asked days earlier. And suddenly he understood how cold that uncertainty feels. I'm sure you'll find a very nice community somewhere. I replied quietly. Vanessa's face changed instantly. There it was. Recognition. I watched the exact moment she remembered saying nearly those same words to me.
Good.
Sometimes people only understand cruelty after hearing their own language return to them. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Daniel whispered something I never expected to hear. Dad knew this would happen, didn't he? The kitchen felt colder suddenly. I thought about Leonard's letter. Silence is not surrender. I thought about the trust, the safeguards, the legal structure protecting me after his death. Then I answered honestly. Yes. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The pain on his face looked real this time. Not financial stress. Not panic.
Grief.
Because in that moment, he finally understood something devastating. His father loved him, but his father no longer trusted him. That realization broke something inside my son, right in front of me. Vanessa noticed it too. And suddenly her tone softened for the first time since all this began. Daniel. But he pulled away slightly. Interesting again. Pressure reveals everything eventually. Daniel looked toward me slowly. Did he say why? I could have lied.
Could have softened it.
But Leonard spent his entire life protecting people from hard truths. Maybe that was part of the problem. So I answered carefully. He believed you confused access with entitlement. Daniel stared at the floor silently.
No defense this time.
Because deep down he knew it was true. Vanessa suddenly stood up. This isn't fair. I looked at her calmly. What exactly feels unfair? That you're using money to control us. The hypocrisy almost exhausted me. You were willing to use dependency to control me. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, because she had no answer. Outside, wind moved softly through the lemon trees. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then finally, Daniel asked the only question that really mattered. If we leave, you'll help save the company? Yes. And if we stay? I held his gaze steadily. Then Henderson Industrial collapses. The words landed heavily. Because unlike threats, truth does not need volume. Daniel looked shattered. Vanessa looked furious. And somehow, neither reaction gave me satisfaction. That surprised me most of all. I thought reclaiming power would feel victorious. Instead, it felt sad, like standing in the ruins of something that used to be beautiful. I slowly stood from the table and picked up my coffee cup. I didn't want this, I said quietly. Vanessa laughed bitterly. You could have fooled me. I turned toward her calmly.
No.
I wanted a family who loved me more than what they could inherit from me. That ended the conversation. Not dramatically, just completely. Daniel sat motionless staring at the table. Vanessa looked away first. And for the first time since Leonard died, the house finally felt honest. Painful. Broken. But honest.
No pretending anymore.
No fake concern.
No polite masks hiding greed.
Just truth sitting openly in the middle of the kitchen where all of us could finally see it clearly. The next morning, I woke up early again. Only this time, I heard suitcases rolling across the upstairs hallway. The suitcases were gone by noon.
No dramatic goodbye.
No screaming match. Just quiet footsteps downstairs, the sound of car doors closing, and then silence settling over the house again.
Real silence this time.
Not tense. Not careful. Just empty. I stood upstairs near the bedroom window and watched Daniel load the final suitcase into the trunk of their SUV. Vanessa never looked up at the house once. But Daniel did. He stood beside the car for a long moment staring at the front door like part of him still hoped I would come outside and stop everything. I didn't. Some endings need to happen completely, or people never learn from them. Finally, he got into the passenger
seat.
The car backed slowly out of the driveway and disappeared beyond the gates. And just like that, the house belonged to me again. I thought I would feel victorious. Instead, I just felt tired. Deeply tired. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after loving people harder than they deserved. I walked downstairs slowly through the quiet rooms. The kitchen looked larger without Vanessa's constant presence filling every corner. Leonard's study remained exactly the way he left it. Even the living room seemed calmer somehow, like the walls themselves had been holding tension for weeks. I opened the patio doors and stepped outside. The Arizona heat wrapped around me softly, while water moved quietly through the fountain Leonard installed for our 25th anniversary. "You need peaceful sounds as you get older," he told me back then. I smiled faintly at the memory. For the first time since his death, thinking about Leonard no longer felt sharp. Still painful, but softer. Like grief had finally stopped fighting me. 3 days later, I met with the company attorneys and financial advisors downtown. The conference room looked cold and expensive in the way corporate offices always do. Glass walls, leather chairs, bottled water nobody drinks. Daniel sat near the far end of the table, looking exhausted. Vanessa wasn't there. That alone told me more than anyone needed to say. The attorneys reviewed restructuring plans carefully while I listened in silence. Emergency funding from the trust would stabilize payroll temporarily. Several assets would be sold. Executive salaries reduced. Expansion projects frozen. Necessary decisions. Hard decisions. The kind Leonard used to make quietly while everyone else slept. At one point during the meeting, Daniel looked toward me and said something I never expected to hear. "You were right." The room became still. Not because of the words. Because of how difficult they clearly were for him to say. I looked at my son carefully. He seemed older now. Not physically. Emotionally, like the last few weeks had finally forced him to grow into the weight of consequences. "I should have protected you," he said quietly. No excuses this
time.
No blaming stress.
No blaming Vanessa.
Just truth. Simple truth. I nodded once. That would have mattered more than the money. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. After the meeting ended, he followed me into the parking garage downstairs. The concrete structure echoed softly, with distant engines and footsteps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, Daniel asked the question sitting between us for weeks. Did Dad stop loving me? The pain in his voice almost broke my heart. Because no matter how badly he failed me, he was still my child. I stepped closer slowly. Your father loved you very much. Then, why didn't he trust me? I thought carefully before answering. Because Leonard deserved honesty. And so did Daniel. Because love and trust are not always the same thing. My son looked away quickly then. Eyes wet. Ashamed. Finally understanding what his father tried to teach him his entire life. Character matters more than access. Responsibility matters more than entitlement. And silence from good people can destroy families faster than cruelty sometimes. Daniel wiped his eyes roughly and nodded once. I'm trying to fix things. I know. Then quietly, almost like a little boy again, he asked, Do you think Dad would have forgiven me? That question stayed inside my chest for a long time. Finally, I answered honestly, yes. Daniel looked surprised. I continued softly, but he would have expected you to become better afterward. My son cried then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly beside his car in an underground parking garage while years of pressure, shame, grief, and regret finally collapsed out of him all at once. And for the first time since Leonard died, I stopped seeing only the man who failed me. I also saw the frightened little boy underneath him. The one who spent his whole life trying to become someone strong enough to impress his father and lost himself along the way. 6 months later, the house feels different now. Peaceful. I kept the garden exactly the way Leonard liked it. The lemon trees survived summer beautifully this year. Every morning I drink coffee on the patio while sunlight moves slowly across the pool. Sometimes grief still arrives unexpectedly. A song in the grocery store, his favorite coffee mug, the empty side of the bed. But grief no longer feels like drowning, more like carrying something heavy with grace. Daniel visits occasionally now, alone. Vanessa left 2 months after the company restructuring began. Apparently, she needed a different life. Funny how quickly people leave once the money stops feeling easy. Daniel never speaks badly about her. Neither do I. Some people punish themselves simply by revealing who they truly are. Last Sunday, Daniel helped me trim the rose bushes near the patio. At one point, he stopped working and looked around the backyard quietly. "Dad really loved this place," he said. I smiled softly.
No, irraplia.
He loved the life we built inside it. That's the part people like Vanessa never understand. A house is never just money. A company is never just assets. And family is never supposed to feel like ownership. That evening, after Daniel left, I sat alone beside the fountain as the sun disappeared behind the Arizona mountains. The air smelled like roses and warm stone. I held Leonard's final letter in my lap and read the last line one more time. Silence is not surrender. For weeks, I thought those words meant survival. Now I understand they meant something else too.
Dignity.
Because in the end, I never needed revenge. I only needed the strength to stop abandoning myself for people who were willing to abandon me first. The day they threw me out like I was nothing, they truly believed I was powerless. What they never understood was this. Leonard didn't leave me $28 million. He left me proof that even after death, someone still believed I deserved to stay.